Okay guys, so I'm going to take us through about 20 minutes of this. We are going to try and get through as much of this as we can in 20 minutes, and then I promise to shut up because I know you probably don't want to hear from me anymore. Fair enough. Okay, just as a quick reminder, Chapter 13 assignments are due tomorrow. There has been a video alternative posted. I think your sub should have some copies of the video questions if you need a hard copy of it. You can also find it on Blackboard. The Reformers chart is still due on Monday. Again, I gave you that yesterday. I think your sub should have some extras if you need that. Notebook quiz. Somebody emailed me and was very pitiful and asked if we could push that back a few days. So we're going to have the notebook quiz on Tuesday, which is new. And then we're still on a pace right now to have the DBQ on Wednesday and the test on Friday, November the 4th. So, all right, let's see if we can do that. Okay, so Era of Good Feelings. We just fought the War of 1812. We kind of have different strands that we have to do. There's an economic strand, there's a social strand, and there's a political strand. We're going to start really quickly with the economic strand. That's the market revolution, which fortunately for us is kind of review since we did it all in that Shark Tank activity that we did last week. Some stuff that I did want to mention is what was it? I've got 2 blanks there on your notes. It should be production and markets. Switch from local to larger scale. So that would be production and markets. Switch from local to larger scale. Again, the idea being that at first, everybody knows who's producing everything and everybody knows who's selling to everybody. But then you hit about 1815 and markets kind of blow up. They get really, really big. So no longer do you actually know who's making and selling the products. As far as that effect on family and gender roles, well, clearly you don't have people like families working inside the house anymore. So, you know, especially once you get the advent of the factory system, it leads to new ideas of what's the proper role for men and women. You know, the idea of men's work being outside the home and women's work being inside the home. There are a few exceptions, things like the Lowell Mill girls in Massachusetts. But again, those are more exceptions than the rule. The idea is that when you get the market revolution, guys go and work outside the home and girls stay inside the home. If you're looking for inventions that caused all this to snowball, you look for inventions and improvements in transportation, which, as we know from Shark Tank, would be what? See, in my mind, you're all like jumping up to answer these questions. That would be like canals and steamboats, railroads, stuff like that. As far as the major improvements in communication, it would be the telegraph by Samuel Morse. And then you want to look at innovations that increased sectionalism. There we go. One of those would be the cotton gin, which again, the cotton gin being a direct cause for the rise in slavery in the South. Cotton gin is like 1793, somewhere along there. The Erie Canal, most people don't realize how much the Erie Canal increased sectionalism, but the Erie Canal really tied together northeast markets with western farming, and it sort of isolated the South. So that increases like the regional differences. And then railroads, because again, railroads were mainly in the north. They didn't have a whole lot of railroads in the South because, you know, we didn't really need them. We got rivers, we got steamboats. You don't really need a railroad. So what area benefited from the market revolution? Definitely it would be that North New England area. Okay, again, for Era of Good Feelings contextualization. Oh, that should be 1816, not 816. Oh, well. All right, contextualization is, again, stuff leading up to the era. So you got to look at Jefferson's presidency and Madison's presidency. What are the 3 big main things under Jefferson? Good. The Revolution of 1800 would be the first one. For those of you who don't remember, that would be the peaceful transfer of power from John Adams, the Federalist John Adams, to Democratic Republican TJ. What would be the next one? That's right, the Louisiana Purchase. Good job. Starting westward expansion, doubling the size of the United States. You remember that one. And then the third big thing would be that embargo, which, as I'm sure you remember, was the economic warfare against Britain. New England merchants despised it. It morphed from the embargo to the Non-Intercourse Act to Makin's Bill number 2. Okay, and then TJ steps down after two terms, and Madison takes over. Really the big thing for Madison is the War of 1812. You know, after the War of 1812, we do have this, like, new culture of nationalism. I would call it sort of a culture of individualism. You definitely have the death of the Federalist Party. That's kind of a big deal. So, yeah. I'd also wanted you to look at things causing sectionalism. That would be the two big things that you'd want to put on that is the slavery issue. Because slavery becomes more and more entrenched in the South. And in the North, it becomes more and more of an aberration. And then the idea of federal power versus state power. Which is ultimately the thing, those two things together ultimately are going to lead to the Civil War. Okay, wanted to bring up this painting. German painter, Krimmel. A couple things that you want to look at there. It's supposed to be a sort of a typical 4th of July celebration. Interesting, though, it's a 4th of July celebration in 1819, so James Monroe would be the president. But they have George Washington here. I'm not sure what the deal is with that, but that's something to kind of look at. George Washington is actually the president that they choose to put up there, not Monroe. Okay. And then another kind of interesting detail on this is that they've got some sort of, I don't know exactly what flag that is, some sort of local civic organization. But they've got the U.S. flag, yeah, but they also have some kind of local civic organization. I just think that might be sort of an interesting, yeah, we're all nationalistic, but we also have this, we're not totally loving the president because we got Washington there, not Madison. And also we've got sort of a veneration of this civic organization too. So that's kind of an important painting. You might see that coming up, I'm just saying. Okay, for James Monroe's presidency. I put up the presidential election maps just to show you what kind of a landslide this was. Rufus King was the Federalist candidate in 1816, and remember, with the Hartford Convention, the Federalist Party pretty much dies. So Rufus King gets hardly any votes, poor guy. And then look over here. Nobody's voting for John Quincy Adams in the 1820 election. He wins in 1824, but the 1820 election, clearly, that didn't go his way. So as far as what you would want to put under significance of the elections, just say it's a landslide for the Democratic Republicans. Judicial nationalism, I'm going to kind of skip over this a little bit because I want to get more into the meat of these notes. For Marbury versus Madison, though, we do know that was a result of the Midnight Judges from John Adams. John Marshall strikes down the Judiciary Act of 1789, gives the court the power of judicial review. McCulloch versus Maryland is the one where the United States states that the bank is constitutional and that states can't tax a federal institution. Gibbons versus Ogden, that's the steamboat case, increasing federal control over interstate commerce. And Worcester versus Georgia is the, Cherokees. That's the one where the Supreme Court said the Cherokees, that the government can't mess with the Cherokees. But Jackson does it anyway because Jackson is Jackson. Okay, so enough on those guys. All right, 3 statesmen that you need to know about are Clay, Calhoun, and Webster. For all 3 of these guys are senators. All 3 of these guys are really, really, really big names. None of them ever get to be president, although Clay runs like 5 times, poor guy. So none of them get to be president, but they're all really influential in policy that's made, which is why I'm going to make you know about them. Okay, on your notes, I basically have given you a little chart there with boxes to write in. I want you to know where each of these guys are from and then kind of what things you want to associate with them. For Henry Clay. All right, Henry Clay is out of Kentucky. Stuff that you want to put down for him is that he was the guy that developed the America system. You remember the America system from yesterday? Actually, it's at the bottom of these notes too. But he's the guy that wanted to push federal government into, helping the country as a whole, not just one region, but the country as a whole. Also for Henry Clay, please go ahead and put down that he's the great compromiser. He's the one that is responsible for all of the major compromises of the 19th century with one exception. And that was only because he was dead. All right, moving on to John C. Calhoun. Scary looking guy. But, very important statesman from South Carolina. Huge advocates of states' rights. Huge advocate of slavery. Actually supported a tariff, which is new because most Southerners don't particularly like tariffs. But actually supported a tariff, at least early in his career, because he thought that it would help the nation as a whole. And then he's also Mr. Nullification. He's the guy that advocates nullifying a big tariff in 1828. No, I'm sorry, the tariff of 1832. Okay, and then skip on over to Daniel Webster from Massachusetts, also kind of a scary looking guy. He was a huge proponent of national tariffs. He loved national tariffs. He thought that it was the best thing because he's from Massachusetts. All they do is produce stuff there. They have factories and stuff. So he loves the idea of a national tariff. And he's probably the biggest critic of the states' rights arguments. So needless to say, Daniel Webster and John C. Calhoun, really, these two don't particularly like each other very much. Clay, on the other hand, kind of tries to sort of ameliorate things and sort of make compromises. These two are like the polar extremes, and Clay is sort of in the middle. Okay, before we get too much farther, I wanted to make sure that we get this treaty, because it's kind of an important treaty as far as, defining the boundary of the nation. Okay, it's the Adams-Onis Treaty. It's the United States and Spain, so the treaty is between the U.S. and Spain. And the big deal is that it established the western boundary of the U.S. So this red line right here. It established the western boundary of the United States. Again, all this stuff is Spanish possessions. You might want to also go ahead and say that the United States bought Florida in this treaty, which was convenient because we'd actually already invaded it, and we'd already been fighting the Native Americans there, thanks to one Andrew Jackson. So again, the United States buys Florida. Spain gets Texas. They won't have it for long, but Spain, at least for a while, gets Texas. Okay, I'm going to pause right here to just see if anybody needs us to go back over anything from the notes again, or if you need to rewind the video. Okay, so we keep going. All right, on to the population maps. Just kind of, again, to sort of show you what's going on. Where is the majority of the population, both in 1810 and 1820? Right, it's up here in the Northeast. But what kind of trend can you see happening between 1810 and 1820, which is only a decade? That's kind of a short period of time. Right, people are starting to move over to the west. Again, you don't have a ton of people, but you have starting to move in the westward expansion. That is kind of important for a couple of reasons. Number one, having the majority of the population up here in the Northeast means that the Northeast kind of rules the House of Representatives, because that's where representation is done by population. So that means that you've got a lot more guys in the House in the Northeast, which is why it was particularly important for Southerners to keep that balance of power in the Senate so that you could have an equal number of slave and free states. Okay, that is what leads us over here to the Missouri Compromise. Remember, the Missouri Compromise is one of the compromises that puts off the Civil War. Missouri Compromise is in 1820. Civil War starts in 1861. So it's one of those things that forestalls the Civil War. Let's make sure that we understand the contextualization there. Things kind of leading up to the compromise, I would say one of them would have to be the Louisiana Purchase, because again, none of this matters if we don't have this territory. So TJ's Louisiana Purchase in 1803. And I would probably go ahead and say the Northwest Ordinance, which, what is that again? That's right, it's how a territory becomes a state. Good. We kind of went over this yesterday a little bit, so I'm going to sort of run through it quickly today. The two big important things about the Missouri Compromise. Number one, Missouri is admitted as a slave state. Maine is admitted as a free state. So you get to maintain that balance of power in the Senate. Still have an equal number of slave and free states. The second important thing is that there is no slavery north of this 3630 parallel, with the exception, of course, of Missouri. The idea, though, is that all this unorganized territory over here would be free territory. The problem comes, though, when we fight against Mexico. When Mexico gets its independence from Spain and we fight against Mexico and we wind up winning this entire territory over here, is all this territory then going to be slave territory? Hang on, that's coming up in the next unit. Another thing that I wanted to make sure to mention here is the Talmadge Amendment. Okay, Senator Talmadge stood up when they were doing the Missouri Compromise and offered an amendment to the compromise that said that all slaves born in Missouri would eventually be freed. First, any slave in Missouri would be freed when they got to be 25 years old. The second thing that he said was no more new slaves would come into Missouri. Okay, the South completely flipped a desk, really freaked out about that, and decided, no, we're never going to let that happen. So the Talmadge Amendment failed. But the important thing is about it that it freaked the South out. That now Southerners are really afraid that the federal government is going to legislate slavery, which makes them more and more entrenched in the idea that we have got to keep a balance of power in the South. We've got to keep a balance of power in the Senate. So even though the Talmadge Amendment failed, it completely freaked out Southern statesmen. All right, as far as critics of the Missouri Compromise, in the South, you had a lot of people hate it because it established the idea that Congress actually could legislate the idea of slavery. They could make laws regarding slavery because, again, they said no slavery below this line. No slavery above this line. So Southerners did not like it because they thought that it established that Congress could make laws on slavery. The North hated it because that it allowed for the expansion of slavery. Again, according to the Northerners, the idea of allowing Missouri in as a slave state, even though you got Maine as a free state, again, you're still allowing for the extension of slavery. The idea that you were allowed to have slavery south of this 3630 parallel, that was kind of an aberration for them, that they couldn't stand that because of how horrible they thought that was. As a spoiler alert, in the next unit we have something called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Obviously, Kansas and Nebraska, somewhere up here around the Arkansas territory, or slightly, I guess, west of the Arkansas territory. Both the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Dred Scott Act, both of them negate the Missouri Compromise. But again, it's one of those things that keeps peace for at least 30 years or so. Okay. You need to know this quote too. But this momentous question, like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror. I considered it at once as the knell of the Union. It is hushed indeed for the moment, but but this is a reprieve only, not a final sentence. Anybody have any clue who this was? Good job. This is Thomas Jefferson, writing to a friend about the Missouri Compromise. He didn't like the Missouri Compromise. He basically said, look, the slavery issue, this is going to be the death of us. We are eventually going to fight because of the issue of slavery. We can't keep compromising about this one. Kind of prophetic because I'm not sure if you know, but we did. We fought over this. It's called the American Civil War. All right. Henry Clay's America System. We did this a little bit yesterday, so I'm going to kind of run through it again today. All right. First one is the rechartering of the Bank of the United States. The charter had expired in 1811. Henry Clay desperately wanted to have a recharter of the bank. Infrastructure improvements, internal infrastructure improvements like the National Road, federal funding for canals, stuff like that. Honestly, it really only helps the North. But he sold it as something that would help all areas of the country. Just, again, it didn't really apply to the South. And then a really high protective tariff, which obviously the vast majority of Southerners hate. So the American system was intended to help the nation as a whole, but it really wound up only helping the South. Okay, again, I want to make sure that you saw things like Cumberland Road. starts here in Maryland, eventually stretches all the way over to St. Louis. The Erie Canal actually wound up being paid for by the state of New York, but if Henry Clay had had his way, it would have been paid for by the federal government. Again, we have plenty of rivers, roads, canals. Did kind of want to bring this up. As far as the West, the West get the idea. They get roads, they get canals, they get federal. Oops, I think I misspelled aid. Whatever. The East got protective tariffs, particularly Northeast. The South didn't really get anything out of the American system, which is why it was kind of a hard sell in the South. Okay, the Monroe Doctrine. This is going to be the last thing that we do, and then I'll cover the corrupt bargain later. Monroe Doctrine stated that America was now closed to any further colonization from Europe. Again, this is a review. We did this one before. If Europe interfered with the sovereignty of any independent nation, we as America would consider it a threat, but we don't actually say that we would do anything about it because we can't do anything about it. Again, it's 1823. We're still a nation of cupcakes right now. Okay, so we'll talk about the corrupt bargain later. Y'all, good job. I really appreciate you sticking with me. And listen to yourself on the next part. Thanks for